Hey everyone, today I'm joined by Jim Palmer. Jim is a fascinating fellow doing some fascinating things in the space of deconstruction and post-deconstruction theology, I guess you could say, with a fascinating story which I want to get into with him to talk about. Jim is a former megachurch pastor. He's been an author. He is an author. And in 2021, he founded the Center for Non-Religious Spirituality, which we'll talk about. And he continues to write a really fascinating Substack called Deconstructionology. Recently, Jim's been kind of engaging with some work of mine and Bobby Azarian's and Cadell Last and other folks in the Metamodern space. So it just seemed like a awesome opportunity to connect and hear some of Jim's story and talk a little bit about this emerging space of maybe post-deconstruction or metamodern Christianity, spirituality, what have you. But we'll get into all that shortly. Thanks, Jim. I appreciate you coming on the podcast.
Hey, it's great being here. I guess we might have met through Cadell. I think through some of his work, I discovered your work and really appreciated a lot of things you have written and, and Bobby and others. So yeah, like happy to kind of chat a bit about it this morning or this afternoon.
Yeah.
I'm on Thetis Island in British Columbia, so it's a little earlier here.
Gotcha. Yeah, well, as you said, yeah, there's a lot of interesting kind of connections starting to be made in this space. So, yeah, why don't we jump back though, kind of all the way and get into your story because I think that that's really important and to help kind of contextualize the work that you're doing. You've had quite an interesting arc, and so why don't you just take it away and we'll spend a
Okay.
little bit of time on that and then bring it up to the present and talk a little bit about the work that you're doing now and how it maybe fits into some of this kind of interesting deconstructive, post-deconstructive, reconstructive aspects of spirituality and issues of meaning making and all that. But yeah, start us off at the beginning, where you're from, what you did, and how you got here.
Yeah, so I guess the Cliff Notes version is that after a pretty volatile childhood and youth, I yeah, at a McDonald's in Blacksburg, Virginia, a friend of mine convinced me that um, turning to God and accepting Jesus as my Savior was the way to kind of like was my path forward. So right before going off to college in that McDonald's, having an egg McMuffin, I kind of committed my life to Jesus and did my undergraduate at East Tennessee State University. And my first week there, I ran into the gentleman who was the campus director of the Campus Crusade for Christ ministry.
Hmm.
So even though I tell people I kind of majored in Campus Crusade for Christ, but officially my major was in journalism, but I totally bought into this idea of the difference my life could make through my religious faith. And Campus Crusade and other, parachurch ministries are very good at, this compelling case of doing something with your life that really makes a difference. And through my involvement at Campus Crusade, I discovered, I could speak, I had some leadership skills, and the combination of all that was enough for me to go off to seminary when I graduated from college. A lot of my friends went on staff with Campus Crusade, but I kind of befriended a guy who was starting a church in the area, and through my friendship with him, sort of thought this is the track that I should take. So I
Well,
moved.
let's pause there just for a second, just because
Okay.
not everyone will probably know what Campus Crusade for Christ is. And I even like my familiarity. I've definitely encountered that organization in my evangelical past. There was an organization called the Navigators, which was more
Yeah.
active on my campus, and I think that they're maybe kind of related or something. But yes, maybe just say a little bit about like what Campus Crusade for Christ is and where it kind of fits in the theological spectrum.
Yeah, no, I think since that, well, Bill Bright is the founder, and I think since then they've changed the crusade part of the name since it's not exactly, the best word to put with religion. But it was kind of the reverse for me. We did not have the navigators, even though the guy who led me to Christ back this summer before, his father was on staff with the navigators. They didn't have that, but they had Campus Crusade. And, I think that I would characterize the Campus Crusade as an evangelical parachurch ministry who sort of mobilizes students on campus and on short-term missions projects to share an evangelical version of the gospel.
Yeah.
They do it through a little track called the Four Spiritual Laws. And, I was on beaches in, Daytona, Florida, and I traveled the world, to Thailand and other places, doing these kind of short-term missionary projects with Campus Crusade. And so I
Yeah, no,
almost
that's really helpful kind of, yeah, because I mean again, I'm familiar with a lot of that, but for those who aren't, I feel like that's helpful to have a sense of that as sort of the catalyst maybe here for someone. So sorry, yeah, so back to your story as you were telling it then.
yeah,
So that gets you onto this particular track. Take it
yeah,
away from there.
that definitely got me into sort of the evangelical world. And the when I befriended this gentleman starting the church, we developed a friendship, and he kind of influenced me to consider going into ministry. So I went to Chicago to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And this is where I got my Master's of Divinity degree. While I was there, my professor suggested they were looking to hire some pastors at a mega church in the area. And at the time, it was the largest church in North America, Willow Creek Community Church.
Hmm.
And I so anyway, I like, okay, and I go out to this church, and I can't find it. I'm driving all over the place, and I can't seem to locate it. And yeah, I drove past it about 5 different times, but I'd never seen a church that big. Like, I wasn't expecting like a university campus as a
Oh
church.
wow.
So I met and became friends with Bill Hybels and Don Cousins and others, and I accepted a position as a pastor at this church, and served there for some years before the plan was to maybe mobilize a group of people to go around the U.S. and start other churches like this. And what I mean by like this, they were referred to as seeker targeted or seeker friendly churches, churches that are designed to prevent a kind of Christianity that would be universally compelling to people, and kind of backing off the more high intensity evangelical, repentance theology kind of message. So I moved to Nashville, and few of us from that Willow Creek kind of mother mega church, and was the founding and senior pastor of Springbrook Community Church, which was a similar kind of growing, thriving evangelical congregation. But then I started noticing some things that became increasingly disturbing, and since this is kind of the Cliff Notes version, I'll kind of, a few of them would be that at some point I started recognizing that despite, my sort of seminary, uh, approved, bulletproof Christian sound theology, despite all that, I began noticing that the problems in people's lives in the church persisted. Depression, anxiety, broken relationships,
Hmm.
you know, a, like it didn't really seem to change that much, was kind of an observation I had one day. And in sort of a moment of rare self, honesty, I realized, well, actually, for myself personally, I was also someone for whom this theological message didn't seem to be really impacting deeply. The
Hmm.
anxiety of running the church, my own internal struggles and so on. And this gradually began to erode my confidence in the theology that I had bought into for myself and the theology that I was presenting other people. We had a few episodes occur in the church. It sort of heightened my questioning of that theology involving some church members. One of them was involved a gentleman on our worship team who was like in a domestic violence situation,
Oh wow.
abusing his wife and some other things like this. And so ultimately I decided that there's something that's not adding up. There's something that's not right. And this led ultimately to my resigning and walking away, not only from that church, my ministerial career, but from the Christianity that I had constructed up to that point, to figure out like, okay, what went wrong? What's the problem here?
Hmm.
And
And would you say at that point, was this a full-on faith crisis, would you say, or was it more just I need to step back and figure some stuff out about my faith, or like what was this like a existential crisis? I mean, obviously to some degree, if you're talking about totally upending your whole career and all that stuff, there's that aspect of it. But
yeah,
I'm always interested in kind of the shades and gradations of crises of meaning and faith crises, which can range anywhere from like this isn't totally sitting right to all out. Oh no, I'm a nihilist now, or something like where along that
right,
spectrum were
yeah.
you kind of grappling with it?
I think for me that um, the the initial parting with the Christian faith, I guess, so to speak, in my ministerial career was sort of the impetus were some of these events that took place that um, were so impactful that kind of led me to I just don't want, I can't do this anymore kind of thing.
Hmm.
And I had and so I very quickly, once I pulled one kind of little thread of that theological belief system, it kind of quickly began to unravel. And so I started writing about my journey of leaving Christianity in my ministerial career, and just started blogging about it. An editor with a major publishing house read the blog, contacted me. Hey, what do you think about maybe writing about this? Don Miller's Blue Like Jazz book, which I don't even know if you've ever heard of. It's kind of like,
Oh, of course, that was a big influence for me. Yeah.
yeah, okay. So it was around the time when Blue Like Jazz had come out, and like no one was really writing a whole lot about religious deconstruction and so on. And of course, at the time, Don Miller, and I haven't kept track, I don't know, but at the time he was single, and it was sort of coming at it from that perspective. And, you know, uh, so that I ended up, that's when I started writing about my journey. The first book, Divine Nobodies, Shedding Religion to Find God and the Unlikely People Who Help You. And that book kind of tells the story of after leaving organized Christianity, the people and the experiences that just continued to call into question the things that I was so confident about in terms of how I understood God, life itself, and so on. I can't say that I ever really kind of toppled into a full blown existential crisis or
Hmm.
into nihilism. I think it's because I pretty quickly found philosophy as kind of a new set of tools to work through it. Um, but then after writing that first book, I was flooded with people, in other Christians and even ministers saying, "Hey, I relate to what you're saying. I'm really struggling with my Christianity," and so on. And then I started interacting with those people, and this was back in the early 90s,
Hmm.
before religious deconstruction was a thing, before religious trauma syndrome was really even on anybody's radar at that point. And so I started meeting with people, and myself and Marlene Winnell and some others kind of did some maybe early pioneering work along these lines of religious deconstruction and religious trauma syndrome. And I built a spiritual direction practice, kind of working one on one with people in terms of their faith transition or their existential crisis or, their deconstruction process and so on. And then,
Yeah, well, I'd be really interested to dig into that a little bit because part of me like wonders like what the orientation or the approach is for that because I guess what I mean is you know let's say someone's having faith issues, they can go to a pastor, but the approach of a pastor is going to be, anywhere from, well, it's awful to have these thoughts and don't, doubt. And hopefully, I mean, that would be a rather unskilled pastor. A more skillful pastor that will, it maybe be something like, well, doubt affects us all. And whether or not that's going to get framed in terms of the devil or not, it might just be sort of like
Right.
we have to grapple with these things, but there's always God. And that there'll be a religious framing to the kind of doubt and questioning and proto deconstruction, you could say. But then obviously there's ways of approaching that outside of that frame entirely, so that it's not just a background context of faith that's sort of grappling with doubt. It's sort of like people holding space for people potentially transitioning out of the religious sphere entirely, and having that be a viable option and not being sort of prejudged or predetermined in that. So I'm curious. Again, like kind of where along this sort of large spectrum. And again, of course, then you could have people who are being like, yeah, go on, deconstruct, throw it all away, burn it down.
Right.
So, right. So there's a broad spectrum there. Talk a little bit about your approach to, working through people's deconstruction processes, with folks who are grappling with that.
Well, I think that you kind of hit it in that there's obviously a real spectrum. I think that when I founded the Center for Non-Religious Spirituality, language is always problematic in many ways, and it's not the Center for Anti-Religion Spirituality, but I want to kind of put something out there to kind of give people an idea that it's cultivating an authentic, liberating spirituality that is not dependent upon organized religion or even
Mm,
traditional religious kind of beliefs. So I think that in terms of deconstruction, and like way back when I was doing my own deconstruction and so on, it was kind of relatively new, and now it's kind of become a thing. There's almost a glut of people that are,
You were deconstructing before it was cool, man.
I guess. But I noticed that what happens a lot of times is that a lot of people doing religious deconstruction are focusing on, what I sometimes call a belief system swap, right? Like
Mm,
you had some really terrible ideas about God. And so now I want to sort of like help you transition into some better theological ideas. Like there was the really bad God of fundamentalist religion that sends people to hell and asked Abraham to sacrifice it, and then there's sort of a reinterpretation of it in order to sort of like um rid itself of some of these unfortunate
mhm.
views of God and present a more positive thing. So it's kind of a belief system swap, which is often useful, right? Like I think the like evangelicals, for example, who want to move forward with a different Christian narrative, this would make sense.
Yeah.
It's not like evangelical, fundamentalist Christianity has the corner on interpreting the Bible and what the Jesus story and all this means, right? Like we have a wide spectrum
They
of
certainly make you feel like they do. That's a
right. There's like everything from fundamentalist Christianity to death of God theology, right? And
right.
everything, kind of in between. But I think that the deconstruction work that I've done with people and that we typically focus on in this training certification and through the center would address something more of like, let's take human development deficits, that there are ways that, and there's even a range in terms of religion's impact, right? There's everything from, people that are deeply harmed by toxic religious indoctrination. Maybe the original sin doctrine could be included here, or the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. That kind of. Then you have all the way the spectrum. And I just recently watched the film Heretic, right? So you got like and these girls weren't this, but in that world, for example, fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, is like cold. Like, I mean, it's a cult. So the religious damage done, for example, in cult groups. So it's a wide spectrum
Yeah.
of things. And so human development deficits is one thing that we focus on, like the parts of your human development that never occurred or were stunted or were corrupted as a result of your involvement in religion.
Hmm.
Critical thinking is a good example. Is you know, learning to develop the skills of critical thinking, having a certain kind of relationship with yourself, like we were chatting about earlier, that I'm working on this series on the psychology of religion, and this article was about Freud, and Freud mentions this kind of masochistic aspect of religious commitment, self-denial, self-repression, self-renunciation, even self-sacrifice and even self-harm.
Hmm.
So that so some of the deconstruction work is cultivating a different kind of relationship with yourself.
Well, in question on that front, so what do you look to? You mentioned critical thinking as like one aspect of this, but like what are the criteria or what's the literature that you draw on, to have a kind of normative sense of human development that you could then compare, deficits to? Like what are you using for that? Is it stuff coming out of developmental psychology? Is it stuff coming like what paradigms are you drawing on to have that basis?
Yeah, I think that an interdisciplinary approach to religious deconstruction is very useful. So that like the series I'm doing on the psychology of religion, to understand some of the psychological components that are involved in religious commitment. Or I mentioned earlier that, philosophy and existential philosophy, for example, provides other ways of thinking about, these existential questions for which a person only learned how to address, through religion.
Hmm.
I think the natural sciences would be another example, and this is, perhaps where like someone like Bobby's book and others that, and I did a series on unifying science and religion in the understanding the natural sciences as a natural and meaningful place to connect with the ideas of establishing a sense of meaning to life and a narrative to um, the trajectory of the universe that doesn't necessarily require, some kind of theism. I did a series on the anthropology of religion, and there, the whole field of the philosophy of religion that kind of steps back and looks at religion not from an adherent or a practitioner of it, but kind of understanding its universal themes, symbols, archetypes, and its universal, sort of significance for all people. And, there's so, like, for example, in the training program, we kind of get in all these areas. People have sort of a reading list and these topics and assignments, and they have a practicum where they have to do so many hours of spiritual direction work with
Hmm.
volunteer directees and so on. But I think that what sometimes happens is that a person might leave religion who was once part of it. So it's likely they mainly have a theological background, and that their approach is mainly going to be to sort of redefine religion in a
Hmm.
better, you
Yeah.
know. And I'm not saying any of that's not useful, it is, but it might be limiting if that's all you do with religious deconstruction.
Well, right. And this is starts to gesture towards something that I find really like one of the more fascinating aspects of what's coming out of all of this deconstruction stuff, which is the reconstruction stuff. And again,
Right.
there's a broad spectrum to that as well.
Yeah.
I'm in like a deconstruction Facebook group, and there's a number of people in there who are always trying to push the reconstruction because it's
Yeah.
like, clearly a primed audience, but and some people who haven't fully gone through or just kind of flirting through with the process, they there's an attraction to sort of be like, oh, well, let's just bypass all this deconstruction bit and jump into some reconstruction because then we won't be
Yeah.
floating in the abyss. But what I find really important and crucial about the reconstruction bit done well is it does raise some really profound questions that are really at the cutting edge of a lot of kind of postmodern philosophy, I would say, and hence the relationship to metamodern thought. Because it's one thing to deconstruct something. It's like, here's a structure that's been given to you. Now let's poke a bunch of holes in it. Let's critique it. Let's, just foreground all the problems and show why it doesn't work. And, there's a method to that. There are methods to that. And that is clearly something that a lot of people can undergo and do. But what it doesn't necessarily then get to is, what do you do after that, right? Like, what do you then move to? And one of the things that's coming out of like what we're talking about now is like, you almost need kind of a meta theoretical context that can be able to negotiate meaning making systems that people move through in order to be able to hold that in any kind of really helpful way. Because, right, otherwise, right, and I think this is also very common, which is like you can kind of be there for someone and hold that space for someone to deconstruct. But then what is offered that can be of use or help or kind of normatively available to someone to make sense of all this? Because on the one hand, you want to hold that space for someone to be able to reject religion entirely, to find a kind of updated sense of their religion if necessary, whatever. But then that relativism can't be entirely open-ended, right? Because then it's
Yeah,
sort of like, oh, I left that cult I was in, but now I've found, this, I don't know, and then name a new cult that they found, right? It's like, well,
right,
that's not going to be helpful either. Or
right,
I found this, ideology, that, after leaving the church, and now I'm able to recognize, that I'm just actually a part of the class struggle and need to go destroy, I don't know, murder CEOs or something. I don't know, whatever it is, right? There are all sorts of other ideologies that can kind of slot into place in similar
right,
pathological ways. So there needs to be some kind of normative theory or approach that can be like, hey, we're engaging in meaning making practices from a kind of higher vantage angle, and we can kind of coordinate and relate these together in order to do some actually productive reconstruction. Anyway, that's
right.
a lot I'm throwing at you, but that's how I see
Yeah.
a lot of this kind of stuff. I
No,
don't know if that brings up anything for you.
yeah, it does for sure. I mean, I think that, you know, I've definitely seen over the course of doing religious deconstruction over the years that a common um, thing that happens is people kind of get stuck in the anti-religion
Mm,
aspect of it. Now, it's a normal part of the process to grieve the losses associated with religion, which is everything from loss of your existential security. It's often the loss of your community, your significant social network and friendships, and so on. So there's, and the feelings of betrayal, disillusionment, anger. I mean, that is part of the process, but you can get stuck in that and maybe never get past it,
hmm
And so I think that highlights the need of what you're talking about in terms of reconstruction. And one of the things I have seen is that people just really stuck in this kind of binary way of thinking about everything. Either God is the Gandalf sky god or there's no God. The
hmm
Bible is either the sole, literal, infallible truth of God or it's bullshit. Jesus was either the atoning sacrifice for the sins of the world or he's worthless and it never
It never
existed.
existed, yeah. All right,
Right.
yeah.
So there's all this, but that's a very limiting way of moving forward. I think the reconstruction and process, it obviously is giving a person the freedom to cultivate a spirituality that's meaningful for them and to cultivate it from the inside out. But one of the things that we talk about in our training is this thing called hermeneutical injustice, which is a person in authority implies that there's really only one main course of action that should be taken, and they withhold
Mm.
other reasonable options that would be worth exploring. And I think that in the reconstruction process, like to get past those binaries and allow or encourage support people to put the pieces together with more
Yeah.
nuances,
Yeah.
which kind of gets into, I think, maybe the metamodern spirituality a little bit. Like if you think of
Yeah,
modernity
no.
as the thesis and postmodernity is the antithesis, and metamodernity is a way of sort of that pendulum swing or that holding space for what's valuable in both. you know. Uh,
Exactly. And I think even just kind of intuitively we've unpacked what I think a kind of basic kind of reconstruction paradigm would kind of have to be oriented towards, right? I mean, because it's precisely that. It's like these we have these false binaries, and maybe it's not so much entirely the content of the binaries themselves that are problematic. It's the fact that we have very simplistic binary thinking that leads to a lot of our problems, and that actually then, it's going to be unhelpful reconstructive practice if it's just let's replace some extreme simplicity for another in the opposite direction. Whereas, how do we hold that nuance? And for me, the big buzzword is complexity. How do we hold these differences? How do we relate them to each other? How do we see? I mean, even what we've kind of been talking about of all these different spectra, of like, I feel like that's such a key move to be able to make most of the time is like that it's not either or. It's like all you have to do is put those two poles on one side of a line, and now you've got this kind of other dimensional thing of seeing that you can relate these to each other, and
right.
so on and so forth. Anyway, so I
Well,
just interesting and kind of organically out of talking about these things, I feel like we build up kind of the basic preconditions for a healthy reconstruction. Just yeah, in doing that. But go on.
no, well, I think that, some years ago, someone said, okay, well, what are you really trying? What's the goal here? And, of course, Cadell, we had a conversation one time about how maybe one problem is that the goal is not to establish sort of the superior belief system, like we finally cobbled together this, I started talking about existential health as a
Mm,
as a worthy way of thinking about the aim here in the reconstruction component. Um, there's Erwin Yalom does a lot of stuff in existential psychotherapy, and Julie Rishi, who I'm going to talk about in this series I'm currently in, does a lot of work around what she calls negative psychoanalysis analysis, um, and existential health being, like for example, cultivating a life that's meaningful for you, having sort of the spiritual immune system to cope with the givens of human existence. Although the word cope is so therapeutic and negative there, but um, to have a rationale for universal compassion and human solidarity, that these are like maybe some of the things that we talk about in terms of cultivating, existential health. Because as you know, like inevitably what happens here is that, going all the way back to Nietzsche and God is dead, is that, there's this grand sort of denial of traditional religion, which is followed up by this huge existential void. And then everyone's trying to figure out, okay, well, what do we need to replace the death of God or this collapse of organized religion? What do we need to replace it with to prevent everything from going off the rails into nihilism and doom and gloom and so on. And then, I think what was interesting about, like, for example, Nietzsche was that the things he came up with weren't really all that far from his Christian background, like
hmm.
the Ubermensch, the Overman is sort of like a Christ figure, and, some other things that he, came up with. And you have Richard Dawkins recently, praising cultural Christianity as a sort of buttress against, radical Islamic sort of um, values and so on, and so there's this sort of like an existential instability, that individually and collectively that has to be addressed,
Yeah.
and that's one of the real things I really appreciate about you've written several books, but the one on the learning process and even some of the romance of reality, that both books were, there was sort of a teleological component in the natural sciences and that Darwinian evolution could be viewed as a sort of universal meaning making framework,
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well, and just real quick on all of that though, because you mentioned Nietzsche, and it's like, yes, on the one hand, he did very famously kind of proclaim the death of God, but he also proclaimed, this vision for like the great health, right? You talked about existential health, and I think if there's one thing for many reasons that Nietzsche was very concerned with, it was kind of reframing issues of yeah, you could say meaning and value along healthfulness, right? Now, whatever his conceptions of that, whether they were good or bad, we can get into all that. But still, that was like, this is a new kind of lodestar, and I think that there are direct correlations between that and what, yeah, I'm trying to get at with this talk of viability and flourishing, and how that is really the focus of meaning making and valuation. And of course, this dovetails very neatly with John Vervaeke's work around wisdom and getting that optimal grip on reality to open you up to reality and all these things. And it's a reframing in a kind of more imminent way, and using language of health and viability and life affirming qualities in a way that all these things, yeah, have come together for me in a way that's very exciting. That also I feel like really like very compellingly answers the call or the challenge even of Nietzsche to try to do this revaluation of values in a new register, in not a purely negative way. And I think people do misread Nietzsche for being just this sort of explosion of dynamite. It's that, but it's also
right.
its own reconstruction, or at least an attempt at reconstruction. And I think the fact that you're naming psychological health and all those other things, I think that starts to gesture towards a way of thinking about these things beyond just a codified belief structure that you either adhere to or have no meaning at all. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think for me, I don't identify as a Christian. I don't identify as an atheist. Even though I see a lot in Death of God theology that's compelling, it's not like I identify as a Christian atheist either. I don't
Hmm.
know if anybody actually would, but they might. I mean,
I think Cadell Lass does, and Slavoj Žižek. I think at least there's
right.
two.
Yeah. Um, I don't know. It's hard to know whether or not, I don't know what they would say. Like if you asked either one of them, well, would they actually say I'm a Christian atheist? Maybe you're right. And then Peter Rollins and so on. But, I think that now the challenge with this is that usually I'm not Christian enough for Christians and not atheist enough for atheists. And,
Hmm.
and I, um, but I have found that there are so many people who are starting to think of religion and spirituality from in complexity and nuances,
Hmm.
like because even now, after all these years, it's interesting that I received the most engagement on um, one of the topics in some of my social media group that always gets a lot of engagement is anything I say about Jesus. Even if I say things like Jesus wasn't a Christian, he didn't even believe in God in the ways that we think, and so on and so forth. The people, it's the most engaged topics is sort of a unchristian Jesus. And so I find I find it interesting that the Christian narrative and the central figure in terms of Jesus has a real staying power,
Yeah.
even amongst people they're doing reconstruction, all the way to the point of a person like Cadell, and others who would consider themselves to be atheists, but find this rich meaning in the Christian narrative.
Well, let's dig into that for a second too. Starting with what your first point, because and actually, I think when we had a conversation, early on to leading up to this, we talked a little bit about labels, you and I, and but I am curious. Like, yes, language is problematic. At the same time, it can still be like a useful heuristic or guide to kind of orient us, right? And my guess would be that a lot of people, if they hear, like, even if they're maybe okay, they're like, yeah, give me some nuance, give me some complexity, right? They will still find labels or terms or framings helpful to be able to situate where is someone coming from, right? And I think by someone coming out and saying, I'm not a Christian, well, that, or I'm, that could mean, well, I'm dogmatically against Christianity. It could mean, I'm
Right.
agnostic. It can mean so many things, right? And one of the things I find interesting about your work is that you do seem to be in this kind of interesting liminal, open, complex, nuanced space where it I get a strong interest in spirituality, however we want to conceive of that from what you're doing. It's not like let's tear it all down. It's like
Yeah.
there's a profound religiosity even to this work. At least that's an intuition, and you're welcome to correct the record. But like, talk about at least your orientation, if not your label or your term of what you'd identify as. But like, what are you getting at with this? Is it um is it when we're talking about even reconstruction and deconstruction, um, is there a background context of sort of like a sense of fullness and richness and life that you're trying to gesture to? Maybe I'm leading the witness here, but or is there a sense more of like we need to take things apart? We need to, is the emphasis is to focus more on the deconstruction part, or is there some kind of background sense of fullness? I'm struggling here obviously because when you take away language and words it becomes difficult,
Right,
but
right.
maybe you can intuit what I'm trying to get at.
I think the focus is for me is reconstruction from the standpoint of um, supporting people or opening up some different pathways for how you kind of put the pieces together. Like for example, and with a real defiance of all binaries. Like I wrote a post what Christians can learn from atheists. And then I wrote one called What Atheists Can Learn from Christians. And of course, Christian atheism sort of, puts those together. In like the psychology of religion, for example, I think traditional Christians often sort of like, demonized and wrote off Freud for reasons that I think are unfortunate. But I think that the new atheists sort of weaponize the psychology of religion in ways that are not very nuanced and
Mm,
kind of only reveal that they don't really understand the topic in many cases of
yeah.
the psychology of religion. And so it's it's not a for me it's not a deconstruction of like burning all religious sentimentality to the studs and the scorcher theory of the new atheists, or at least some of them. I mean, Sam Harris has loosened up and become a much more spiritual
Hmm.
person than maybe some of his early work, where he essentially called all religion mental illness.
Right.
And
Well,
so I think that like I want to create a space where people are willing to have the conversation, to learn something new, to think differently, to deconstruct towards reconstruction. Um, and you, uh, and I just have find increasingly numbers of people who really are interested in doing that. But I think the trick is you just kind of have to be fair. Like you
mm,
can't take one side over the other entirely.
yeah.
Like um, I mean, I guess you could if that's the way you really felt, but like I might do an article where I completely agree with half the stuff that Dawkins or Hitchens said about, and write another one really criticizing their lack of understanding of the nuances of religion, and I've come to understand even for myself that I can't use, my understanding of religion is not representative of every person's experience of religion through all of history, right? Like William
Yeah.
James used the word religion essentially to talk about what we now would maybe use the word spirituality to refer to.
Mm.
And the word religion has kind of fallen out of favor. And, you know, it's a bit of a struggle more with the discussion about God, because I think that what I kind of bump into a little bit is how much do you sort of like strip away from God the traditional view and still call it God?
Right.
You,
Well, I mean, so this gets back to the issue of like Christ remaining this very potent figure even for atheists, right? And what is that? And the same with God, right? Like, at what point can one use this religious language and these symbols and these figures and and still be what, like that's I think a big question. At which but related to that and also somewhat prior to it, I I would suggest, and I guess I'd ask too, about the integrity behind these kinds of engagements. And what I mean by that isn't like honesty or something like that, but I mean the integrity of like something holding together that has its own kind of coherence to it.
Yeah,
And so, some people could look at, oh, I wrote one post and I agreed with, pretty much all of Dawkins and these folks, and then the other post I do the opposite. Some
right,
people will look at them and say, oh, well, I guess this person has no coherence to their way of seeing the
right,
world. They're just going to flip flop and go back and forth. And that
yeah,
is kind of a genuine critique of where it does fit, like of certain kinds of postmodern relativism, these sorts of things. Oh, we can
right,
see it from these different perspectives. But I
right.
don't think that's what you're doing. It's certainly not what I'm particularly interested in, which is I'm looking for that broader coherence that can that can do those kinds of moves, but out of a place of a deeper sense of conviction that makes sense so that you can actually put them together, right? And
Right.
that's that I think that nuance and complexity that we're talking about. So I don't know, just on that point first, speak to a little bit of like how you are getting at these when you are making those kinds of leaps back and forth. Is there a deeper coherence that you're working with there?
Yeah, I think that maybe one kind of quintessential example would be the Dawkins, Jordan Peterson, whatever
Mm,
you want, that discussion or
yeah,
debate.
yeah,
That it was it's kind of like, okay, like we want to talk about it in terms of like who won, right? Like who won the debate. But Dawkins is talking about something in some ways completely different than what Jordan Peterson is
yeah.
talking about. And they both have value, like one shouldn't write off Dawkins because he's not getting what Peterson's trying to, and Peterson shouldn't lambaste Dawkins because like so. For example, when I wrote the article, I was critical of Dawkins partly for what seemed to be the hypocrisy of sort of championing cultural Christianity when my criticism was, well, okay, you've spent all this time kind of saying the atheists, you don't need God to be good, but yet you're arguing that we need cultural Christianity to keep values of democracy and so on in play without the collapse of the West. Okay, well, you either need to do a better job with your atheism of grounding people in, virtue and ethics and morality and democracy. How come you're not taking that stance? Why are you kind of caving into that we need So I think as an evolutionary biologist, what Dawkins says is tremendously valuable, and the Christian and the atheist should, can find meaning in that. But on the other hand, Dawkins isn't the expert in speaking about all religion. In fact, there's large swaths of it I don't think he really even appreciates or understands. Partly just because it's not his focus, like
Hmm.
of course, he's going to reject religion. You can't prove religion ontologically or any other way using the scientific method. And for these reasons, he doesn't see it as a reasonable position to take. And I get that, so I think though, maybe to answer so to me, the integrity is that to deconstruct something enough to where you can appreciate the contribution and the value of what's being said, even if the totality of their views on everything don't, make a lot of sense in some ways.
Hmm.
Like we could even Jesus, like example. To be fair, I I give preference to Jesus as a religious figure. I tend to, I had someone push back and say, Jim, okay, how come you're claiming that Jesus like saw worth and dignity and everybody like you totally make Jesus into the perfect man of wisdom and ethics and morality, but what about these verses where Jesus says this or that or whatever, so I think that the I know that this might be a simplistic way of putting it, um, but it does seem like that all religion and philosophy has some common ground to build on, even though there's different language to articulate it. I mean, I'm not pretending that science and religion and philosophy are all saying the same thing exactly, but I think there's enough there to find an integrity or a coherence. If we just really wanted to simplify it, which is a bad simplification, but some people will, write like the idea that um, you could stop at any moment in life and you could simply ask the question, what would it mean right now for me to be loved, for example? That this might be an approach a person could take in life. Now, that doesn't mean that the answer is easy, right? What it takes to be loved with the person who's your best friend versus being loved with the person who's abused or victimized you. They're two different answers, but at least you could argue that maybe it's the right question.
Sure.
Maybe
Yeah.
there are universal sort of ideas and truths that are kind of beyond dispute on, and as a starting point of reconstruction.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think actually you using the word totality gets at something important there, right? Which is that these different perspectives can be offering something really valuable that we can acknowledge and try to integrate and appreciate. Even if the totality of them has problems. But that's maybe the problem, is that when you try to do something in a totalizing way in a particular direction, maybe that's going to introduce, certain kinds of pathologies. And rather than taking one totality and just pitting it against another totality, maybe we need to compare totalities in a sense, as being part of a broader totality that they're actually both speaking to in their own ways. And maybe one is speaking to some aspects of that broader totality better than the other, and so on. And again, that to me provides a really nice kind of meta theoretical coherent approach to these kinds of issues.
Yeah,
And
because
but yeah, go on.
I was just going to say that the subject, to use that term, the person looking out at all this, you know, has the sort of opportunity and responsibility for putting it together in meaningful ways. Like for example, the objects are all fallible, right? Like I say things that are useful and things that aren't. I probably have ideas that are just ridiculous, and none of us are perfect, right? None of us are the sole source of truth. We make our contribution to it. We're just like the biblical writers didn't operate in a vacuum. So I don't either. I'm influenced by culture, my upbringing, my conditioning. And so as much as I might work to sort of be aware of it, I'm still that, to some extent. The
Well,
Buddha.
just to pick up on that, I think that one, it's always a really good sign or tell that someone is trustworthy if they make those kinds of pronouncements. If someone's
Yeah,
saying, "Oh,
yeah,
I do have all the answers," then it's sort of like, that person
right,
probably doesn't have all the answers. And which isn't
right.
to say that people who say that they don't do,
Yeah,
but it's just there's something more revealing about that kind of epistemic humility that I feel like that's the direction I'm going to tend to go in, because that's been the one that tends to lead towards
yeah,
that greater wisdom. But I wanted to throw this out because I actually think this is a really interesting point and an interesting question, and it's a controversial one, but I think it's really interesting and crucial maybe, which is you brought up Jesus. And on that topic, like you mentioned, well, Jesus says these one things that make him sound like the paragon of wisdom and virtue, but then there are these other verses.
yeah,
And this is a interesting dividing line for me amongst a bunch of different ways of being Christian, because I feel like one of the things I see, some continuity that I find in all, or not all, but many different kinds of Christianity, is some kind of notion that whoever Jesus was, he's sort of beyond, any
right,
kind of critique or reproach, or that he never could have been wrong. So, and that goes obviously very clearly in fundamentalism. But even in like very liberal forms of Christianity, then Jesus just becomes a kind of reflection of liberal Christianity. And it's like, oh, look, Jesus was pro-immigrant and pro-socialism apparently, and universal healthcare and all
right.
these things. They make a lot of arguments that then lays that all at Jesus's feet as being, see, like he did it this way. And I want to go further than that still. And I think it's really important to make that move. And again, it's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people, but like, was Jesus wrong about some things, right? And here's where I
Yeah.
think some of the historical stuff and the criticism, the biblical criticism can be really helpful for like a more healthier biblical hermeneutic because like yep, the apocalypticism bit didn't really pan out so well. And maybe some of this bringing the sword bit and maybe some of this, stuff about divorce and whatever, right? There's aspects of cultural change that have occurred that now in retrospect we can look back and even at such, for such a religious figure of insight and wisdom and rectitude and whatever adjectives we want to heap upon Jesus as this sort of moral exemplar and religious exemplar. Even for all that, we can also say, except for this wasn't quite right. And that I feel like
Right.
is an interesting dividing line, but I think it's an important move to make, and I recognize that's controversial. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that, of course, the only thing we really know about Jesus is the Gospels, right? Like, and the Gospels, three of them are roughly the same, and they're comparatively short, right? And somebody had to make some choices about what got in and what got, no matter how integrity filled that process was, like there was some principle or decision making about what got in and what got out, So I think that unfortunately, Christianity seemed to establish the idea that the starting point with Jesus is he just has to be perfect,
Hmm.
sinless. I mean, we gave him a virgin birth to really make sure that this occurred, that he wasn't tainted by human conception and the sin condition and so on. And so, I mean, if you take those kinds of things, literally, um, I personally don't, I wouldn't view Jesus with any less um, admiration, if he had too much to drink at these feasts, if he like totally lambasted religious people as he did, if he had had an active sexual life, if he used cussed out somebody on the road, like and was a little unhinged here and there. Like none of these things would really affect the way I kind of think about. It seems like that the dominant discourse about Jesus seems to be that his central claim was that God and humankind are one.
Hmm.
That there is the idea of separation theology is a farce. And it seems that although raised a Jew, that in that context, Jesus was almost very consistently confronting, exposing the way that the religious establishment had conceived of God, and that so he's kind of an anti-religious establishment sort of individual who ultimately lost his life as a result of it. Now,
Hmm.
I think that where the death of God theology kind of maybe asserts, which I understand its value, that this defiance of religion ultimately leads to the best of the Christian narrative is to understand the incarnation and the crucifixion as God sort of this self-emptying of God as other, the sort of absencing of God as other from the universe, and then the resurrection being the spirit of that, being within humankind. That's kind of a terrible way, but you know, uh, so I think that I personally don't need Jesus to be perfect. I don't need Jesus to be sinless for me to find value. You know, I could say that Jesus is not significant because he's more divine than any of the rest of us. He was significant because he was courageously more human than most of us are,
Hmm.
and that this is one of the great values of Jesus was his kind of courageous humanity, to confront, speak to power, to deny the tenets of traditional religion, to stand in solidarity with those who are marginalized and condemned. That this was sort of the figure of Jesus. And, was viewed as a threat to the political and religious establishment, and ultimately led to his death. Now, there's all these atonement theories, and Gerard has his the scapegoat theory, and all these there's different ways of understanding what happened surrounding Jesus and the story and his death and all this. But as it's hard to know how much of this Jesus would have had in his own mind, or if we just kind of come up with the Jesus we most need.
Yeah. No, yeah, I hear all that. I mean, yeah, and I guess part of why I bring it up is because we were talking about, binaries and either or thinking and even, more complex, nuanced readings of the Gospels that want to kind of get beyond kind of more, yeah, just simplistic kinds of theology and see something more expansive. I feel like even those can fall for the trap of the simple binary thinking in the end of just laying all of that good stuff as, and I think that there's something maybe then really challenging, but inherently then of value by being able to at least entertain the notion that maybe even Jesus doesn't fall in this simple either or good or bad kind of thing, that there's some nuance there. And I guess I don't know, for me, I think it's helpful that these ways of thinking can be construed as Christian, right? I know maybe you wouldn't identify that way, and maybe I wouldn't, or maybe depending on the context we would or wouldn't, depending on
Yeah,
who's asking and what do you mean by that term, all those sorts of things. But I feel like if there's a future for Christianity, which there certainly is,
yeah,
and a very robust one that's really sinks into the depths of reality, I think it kind of leads in this direction, I guess. And so I rather than wanting to just allow Christianity to be defined by more simplistic theologies, I would like to see Christianity flourish by being engaged more complexly in a more nuanced fashion that could grapple with all of the stuff that we're talking and still be saying, yeah, that's Christianity, and not have to like qualify that too much is an interesting way of thinking about, what maybe a metamodern kind of Christianity would be. But I'll stop pontificating. We should actually probably wrap this up.
okay,
I soon anyway. At least I want to
yeah,
give you the opportunity for a couple of things. One is I didn't mean to interrupt at many points. So if there was
no,
anything that I did interrupt that you wanted to finish as a thought, but two, there are aspects of your biography that we didn't really necessarily fully unpack, and the stuff that you're doing with your deconstructionology, Substack, and any of that. So I wanted to give you an opportunity if you wanted to, bring the story up to the present, as it were, to bring any of these strands together in what you're up to now, and any of the stuff that you'd like to make people aware of that you're doing.
yeah. Well, just to follow up real quick on a point that you made is that the one thing that Christian atheism really kind of took me by surprise when I discovered it is that, like, okay, you have atheists, right, who see the Christian narrative as absolutely central. In fact, I think there are those who say that the true atheism has to come through Christianity,
Mm,
even for, and so to me, that's hopeful to the extent that what is Christianity or the Christian narrative, holds a lot of value in a lot of different ways for people, and religious deconstruction shouldn't be sort of just a quick dismissal of Christianity. You know, I mean, Carl Jung and others saw a lot of archetypal significance in the
yeah,
Christian narrative. And so, this is why I kind of get frustrated a little bit with new atheists, is that it's kind of a straw man to sort of fight against the most extremist forms of
yeah,
Christianity on the basis of that, write off all religion of any value whatsoever. So I think that for me, what I'm doing with what I'm doing for the Center for Non-Religious Spirituality is creating space and a network of some support and resources for people to reconstruct without trying to kind of steer them
hmm,
overtly into something, and give them maybe the pieces for them to kind of and then or give them pathways to explore. I mean, like someone asked me recently, what do you think has been the most significant part of your deconstruction? And this sounds so, uninspiring, but honestly, knowledge has been central to my deconstruction. It's like the more I know,
mm,
the more I've learned, the more I've explored and investigated all these,
mm,
different fields. I feel like that is made, just an absolute, it has been at the center of my deconstruction has been knowledge,
Mm.
So with deconstructionology, which is where I publish on Substack, is kind of okay, let's issues around religion, spirituality, philosophy, existential matters. Okay, let's take this stuff apart and look at it. And let's not judge this or that or get into binary thinking or let's kind of just keep deconstructing it until we really mine out where it has value universally. No matter how it was characterized or whether it started, whether Richard Dawkins said it or Jordan Peterson said it, or Eckhart Tolle said it, or Bobby Ovarian said it, or Brendan Dempsey said, let's appreciate it as the raw materials to cultivate a consequential, authentic, liberating spirituality, moving forward. And, you know, the, the language is always going to be an issue. People say, well, Jim, are you a Christian? Of course, my response is, well, it kind of depends on what you mean by that. Or people say, Jim, do you believe in God? It's kind of like, well, it depends on what God we're talking about. I guess we're always going to have this problem with lived language. And there's not really a lot of better replacement language, right? Like, if you want to call God, ground of being or source or energy or whatever, that's not great either. It's got a downside. And, so
Well,
I
well,
guess,
on that, so here's one last question and a good place to, because yeah, good place to conclude the telos of this conversation. If there were a God that you could say that you did believe in, so to speak, describe that God.
well, it's interesting because, of course, the rabbi asked Einstein, do you still believe in God, right? Because his faith was being questioned. And Einstein's answer was, well, I believe in Spinoza's God. And I wrote an article about Spinoza, which he kind of like is known for this philosophical monism, which the idea that there's only one thing and everything else is sort of a expression of that. And I think that it seems like the universally accepted cosmology is that there's, whether you come at it from science, philosophy, or religion, with the exception of monotheism, I guess, is that, well, even is that there's essentially that there is a one essence of existence from which everything else derives its form, its experience, and so on. And, you know, I'm thinking about what I just wrote on Freud, who says that the oceanic feeling is really the core
Mm,
energy of all religion. And so I think that when a person allows themselves to kind of press into this universal, whatever you want, life, ground of all being, that there is an oceanic feeling often that seems to indicate that it has deep meaning for at least the human person,
mm,
to the point where Jesus would refer to it with the metaphor of father. Others would use the word love, like you experience it. So in essence, I guess I would say that if someone pinned me, well, Jim, okay, what is God to you? I guess I would say something like the God is the ground of all being, in which I most readily access through, feelings of love, belonging, this oceanic feeling of being one with the whole. I wrote a series on psychedelics about how this unitive experience is often what people
mm,
say this dissolution of the ego and this sort of unitive experience of being connected to all and the whole. You know, but then of course you have to, the trip is over and you come back to life, so
yeah.
I think that when we touch it, whether through meditation, psychedelics, Christianity, you know the significance of Jesus is that he brought human expression and embodiment to that.
Mm, mm. Amen, brother. Sounds like a quality theology to me, I would say. But um, Jim Palmer, this was awesome. Thank you so much for your
Yeah,
time. I'll
I
of course
appreciate it.
I'll link your Substack and yeah, share this around. But really appreciate your perspective and the work that you're doing. It's good stuff. And Godspeed, my friend.
All right, thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay.